Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you grateful for your memory foam mattress and blackout curtains. We're exploring the absolutely bizarre sleep habits of the Vikings, those legendary Norse warriors who apparently had some very unconventional ideas about catching some rest. Now grab your favorite blanket, maybe put on some ambient sounds, and let's journey back to a time when bedtime was less about comfort and more about survival. Picture this. You're exhausted after a long day of farming, fighting, or figuring out which neighboring village to raid next. The sun has disappeared behind the mountains, and you're ready to collapse into bed for 8 solid hours of uninterrupted sleep. Except, if you're a Viking living in medieval Scandinavia, that's not how sleep worked at all. Because the Norse had developed one of the most peculiar sleep patterns in human history, something that would seem absolutely insane by today's standards. The Vikings, along with most of medieval Europe, practiced what historians call segmented sleep. This wasn't some wellness trend or productivity hack. This was their natural rhythm. Instead of sleeping through the night in one continuous block like we do today, they would sleep in 2 distinct phases: first sleep and second sleep. Imagine going to bed around sunset, sleeping for about 4 hours, then waking up in the dead of night completely alert and functional. You'd stay awake for an hour or 2, maybe 3, doing various activities, and then return to bed for another 4-hour stretch until dawn. This wasn't insomnia. This wasn't a sleep disorder. This was completely normal. In fact, if you managed to sleep through the entire night without waking up, people might have thought something was wrong with you. The Vikings had essentially programmed their bodies to operate on a split schedule that would drive modern sleep specialists absolutely crazy. So, what exactly happened during this mysterious middle-of-the-night awakening? Well, the Vikings weren't just lying there staring at the ceiling, wondering why they couldn't fall back asleep. This midnight interval became a productive and often intimate part of their daily routine. They had things to do, people to see, and priorities that couldn't wait until morning. Food was often the first order of business. Without refrigeration or late-night delivery options, Vikings kept dried meats, smoked fish, and leftover stew within arm's reach of their sleeping areas. These midnight snacks weren't about satisfying cravings. They were practical necessities. If you'd spent your evening rowing a longship, hauling lumber, or dragging a freshly hunted deer through the snow, waking up hungry in the middle of the night was perfectly normal. So they'd quietly stoke the fire, warm up whatever was available, and eat by flickering firelight like some kind of medieval midnight feast. But food wasn't the only thing on the midnight agenda. This quiet time between first and second sleep became a period for deep reflection and spiritual connection. Without electric lights, smartphones, or any of the distractions we deal with today, Vikings could sit by the dying embers of their fire and actually think. They'd contemplate life, death, their relationship with the gods, and whether their sword technique was up to Odin's standards. Some believed that dreams from first sleep were clearer and more meaningful, like direct messages from the spirit world. Others spent this time in whispered conversations, planning the next day's activities, or working through family disputes. And then there was intimacy. Yes, archaeological evidence and medieval writings suggest that many Viking couples considered the middle of the night prime time for romance. It actually makes perfect sense when you think about it. You'd had a few hours to rest and recover from the day's exhaustion, but you weren't completely drained yet. The fire was already burning, providing warmth and a romantic ambiance. Privacy was limited in Viking households, So the quiet hours when everyone else was sleeping offered a rare opportunity for couples to connect. Some historians even suggest that Vikings timed their reproductive schedules around this midnight interval. Talk about planning ahead. But here's where Viking sleep gets even more interesting. These weren't people who could afford to let their guard down completely, even during rest. The Viking world was dangerous, unpredictable, and filled with threats that didn't respect bedtime schedules. Villages could be raided, livestock could be stolen, and enemies had this annoying habit of attacking right before dawn when people were most vulnerable. So Vikings developed sophisticated sleep strategies that prioritized survival over comfort. Sleep shifts were a crucial part of Viking culture, especially when traveling or during times of conflict. On longships, in military camps, or even in larger settlements, someone was always awake. It might be the ship captain, a trusted warrior, or just the guy who lost at dice and got stuck with watch duty. But the point was that no one was ever completely defenseless. These shifts ran in cycles, with groups taking turns between sleeping and standing guard. One team would rest while another kept watch. Then they'd switch positions. The result was that nobody ever got a full night's uninterrupted sleep, but nobody got murdered in their sleep either. It was a Viking-style compromise between rest and survival. Even in their own homes, some form of night watch was common. In the large communal buildings called Longhouses, where entire families and their animals lived together, someone might stay up tending the fire, listening for wolves, or just making sure the livestock weren't causing trouble. This wasn't just about safety, it was about cultural identity. Vikings took pride in being constantly ready for action. A true Viking warrior wasn't supposed to sleep like he was already dead. He was supposed to sleep like he might need to grab an axe and start swinging at any moment. This mindset extended to how Vikings prepared for sleep, especially during dangerous times. Picture this scene. It's midnight in a Viking longhouse. Frost covers the small windows. There's a smoky fire burning in the center of the room, and half a dozen Norse warriors are curled up under rough woolen blankets. Now look closer. None of them have changed into pajamas or comfortable sleepwear. There are no bedtime routines involving brushing teeth or putting on soft robes. These Vikings are sleeping fully clothed, often in the exact same garments they wore throughout the day. This wasn't about being lazy or having poor hygiene habits. This was about survival strategy. Viking clothing was designed around layering for warmth and protection. Wool tunics, linen undershirts, thick cloaks, and fur when they could get it. These weren't just outfits, they were survival equipment. If you undressed for bed in medieval Scandinavia, you were basically asking to wake up with hypothermia. The climate was harsh, the buildings were drafty, and heating was limited to whatever fire you could keep burning through the night. But Vikings took this practicality even further. Warriors, especially when traveling or during periods of conflict, might sleep with some of their gear still on. Not full chainmail, unless they were extremely hardcore or had a terrible sense of what constituted comfort, but enough equipment to be ready for action. Helmets might be placed within arm's reach, weapons kept close at hand, cloaks remained fastened. The idea was simple. If someone kicked down your door with hostile intentions, you didn't want to waste precious time getting dressed and armed. You wanted to go from sleeping to fighting in under 5 seconds. There are historical accounts describing warriors who dozed with their helmets nearby, weapons positioned beside their bedrolls, and cloaks still wrapped around their shoulders. This wasn't about being paranoid. This was about being practical Viking homes were often isolated, vulnerable, and constructed from materials that wouldn't stop a determined attacker. Bandits, rival clans, and wild animals didn't send advance notice before showing up. Being caught unprepared while sleeping was a quick way to become the subject of a very short saga that nobody would remember fondly. The weapons themselves weren't stored away in chests or armories during sleep time. Axes leaned against walls within easy reach. Swords lay beside sleeping areas. Spears might be wedged under bed frames for quick access. A well-prepared Viking could transition from snoring peacefully to wielding a deadly weapon faster than most people today can find their phone charger in the dark. This constant state of readiness came with obvious risks. Accidental injuries from sharp objects in dark spaces weren't uncommon, but Vikings considered this an acceptable trade-off. Better to risk a small cut from your own sword than to risk being defenseless against someone else's. Now, let's talk about the actual sleeping arrangements, because Viking beds weren't exactly what you'd find in a modern furniture catalog. The average Viking didn't have access to elaborate four-poster beds with silk curtains and down-filled mattresses. Those images come from Hollywood fantasies, not historical reality. For most Vikings, sleeping arrangements were far more basic, practical, and often shared with more people and animals than you might expect. The wealthy elite did have proper beds. Archaeological excavations have uncovered bed frames in high-status burial sites, complete with decorative carvings and metal fittings. These were substantial wooden constructions, often built like boxes and partially enclosed to trap body heat and provide some privacy. Some even had curtains or hangings to keep warmth in and snoring relatives out. But these luxury sleeping arrangements were reserved for nobles, successful merchants, and powerful Jarls who could afford such extravagances. For common Vikings, the sleeping situation was much more humble. Most people slept on the floor, on simple benches, or on raised wooden platforms positioned near the central hearth. Comfort came from piles of straw, moss, or stuffed fabric sacks if they were fortunate. Old boat sails or animal skins served as blankets and ground covers. The goal wasn't softness or luxury. The goal was staying warm enough to survive until morning, without freezing solid. And forget about having your own bedroom. The Viking Longhouse was essentially one giant multi-purpose space that served as kitchen, dining room, bedroom, workshop, and animal shelter all rolled into one. Beds, when they existed, were built into the walls or arranged along the sides of the main hall. Otherwise, people just found a spot on the floor and made it work. If someone rolled into your sleeping space during the night, congratulations. You were now sleeping buddies, whether you liked it or not. The sleeping arrangements also reflected social hierarchy and family structure. The heads of the household typically got the warmest spots closest to the central fire. Children were packed in wherever they could fit. Servants, distant relatives, and guests got the outer edges of the sleeping area, possibly next to the door, the animals, or both. If you woke up with a goat standing on your chest or a chicken pecking at your hair, well, that was just Tuesday night in a Viking household. Cleanliness was another ongoing challenge. You couldn't simply throw your bedding in a washing machine every week. Straw mattresses were shaken out when they started smelling too much like the animals that shared the space. Furs and fabric coverings were cleaned when weather permitted and time allowed. Fleas, lice, and other unwanted roommates were accepted as unavoidable facts of life. The priority was staying warm and alive, not maintaining hotel standards of hygiene. Still, even with all these challenges and discomforts, Vikings weren't chasing perfect sleep quality the way we obsess over REM cycles and sleep optimization today. They were focused on getting enough rest to survive harsh winters, demanding physical labor, and the constant possibility of violence. Sleep was functional, not recreational. But the story of Viking sleep habits gets even stranger when you consider the poorest members of their society and the extreme conditions they endured. If you were a Viking of modest means, and by modest I mean you owned basically nothing except maybe a rusty farming tool and some questionable cheese, then your sleeping arrangements took a dramatic turn for the worse. We're talking about sleeping directly on dirt. Not metaphorically dirt poor. Literally sleeping on packed earth floors with nothing between you and the ground, except whatever animal skins you could scrounge up. Inside Viking longhouses, floors were typically made of compacted dirt, sometimes mixed with straw to absorb spills and provide minimal cushioning. But calling it cushioning is generous. It was more like sleeping on a slightly softer version of concrete. For the truly impoverished, this might be their only option. No wooden platforms, no raised benches, just animal pelts spread over hard earth in whatever spot offered the best access to the fire and the least chance of getting trampled by livestock. The positioning of these floor sleepers followed a strict social hierarchy. If you were sleeping by the door, that meant you ranked somewhere between welcome guest and human doormat. Sure, you were allowed inside, but you were also the first person anyone would encounter if they decided to break in with violent intentions. It was like being a medieval security system, except instead of an alarm, you were the thing that got stabbed first. But sleeping on dirt did have one surprising advantage. Earth actually retains heat better than you might expect, especially when you're sandwiched between other warm bodies and maybe a friendly dog or two. When your biggest enemy is freezing to death before sunrise, you learn to appreciate any source of warmth, even if it comes with a side of back pain and the occasional rock digging into your ribs. Of course, this sleeping arrangement came with zero back support. There were no chiropractors in the Viking Age, no ergonomic sleep consultants, and definitely no memory foam. If you threw out your spine sleeping on the ground, your treatment options were basically walk it off or become a storyteller. Physical therapy meant continuing to work until either your back got better or you died. Vikings weren't particularly sympathetic to complaints about comfort. Still, sleeping on the ground wasn't considered shameful or degrading by Viking standards. In their culture, toughness was valued above luxury. If you could sleep on packed earth and wake up ready to raid a monastery or wrestle a bear, you were doing just fine. Comfort was viewed with some suspicion, as if too much softness might weaken your warrior spirit or make you unprepared for the harsh realities of medieval life. Now, if you think sleeping alone on dirt sounds rough, wait until you hear about the Viking approach to communal sleeping. Because privacy, personal space, and separate bedrooms were concepts that Vikings treated like expensive foreign luxuries they couldn't afford and didn't particularly want anyway. Viking sleeping was fundamentally a group activity. Entire families, extended relatives, household servants, occasional guests, and yes, various farm animals, all shared the same sleeping space. This wasn't a lifestyle choice driven by some ancient philosophy about community bonding. This was pure survival necessity. In medieval Scandinavia, where winters could kill you and heating fuel was precious, body heat was a shared resource that nobody could afford to waste. Longhouses were designed around this principle of thermal efficiency over individual comfort. Picture one enormous room with a central fire pit and people arranged around it like human logs, all trying to absorb as much warmth as possible before the fire died down. The closer you could get to the heat source, the better your chances of surviving until morning. This created a sleeping hierarchy based on social status, age, and health. The elderly and sick got prime real estate near the fire. Children were tucked in wherever they'd fit safely. Everyone else filled in the gaps. But this cozy arrangement came with obvious challenges. Snoring wasn't just an annoyance. It was a communal experience that everyone had to endure together. If your uncle had sleep apnea, the entire household knew about it. If your cousin talked in their sleep about embarrassing personal details, that became family entertainment. Privacy was essentially non-existent, which meant personal hygiene, romantic relationships, and basic human dignity all had to be managed within earshot and eyesight of multiple generations of relatives. The sleeping arrangements also reflected complex family dynamics and social relationships. Who got to sleep where wasn't random. It was a carefully negotiated system based on respect, authority, age, and practical considerations. Married couples might get a slightly more private corner, but they were still sharing the space with children, in-laws, and whoever else needed shelter for the night. And then there were the animals. Because Vikings didn't just tolerate sharing their sleeping space with livestock, they actively planned their entire home design around it. This wasn't some charming rural tradition or quaint farming custom. This was calculated survival strategy disguised as interior decorating. Viking longhouses were multi-purpose buildings designed to house humans and animals under the same roof. The structure was typically divided into sections, with one area designated for people and another for livestock. Sometimes there was a raised threshold or wooden partition between these zones. Sometimes there was just a general understanding that the cows went on one side and the humans went on the other. And sometimes, especially during the coldest weather, that distinction became more of a loose suggestion than a firm rule. The logic was simple and effective. Animals generate body heat just by existing. A single cow could warm up a significant portion of a small building. Multiple cows were basically a medieval heating system that also provided milk, meat, and leather. Chickens were less effective as heaters, but still contributed to the overall thermal environment while producing eggs and entertainment. The animals weren't exactly roaming freely through the sleeping areas, but the separation between human and animal space was often minimal. Livestock had their own stalls or designated areas, but sounds, smells, and the occasional escape attempt were just part of the nightly experience. You might fall asleep to the gentle lullaby of horses snorting, cows chewing, chickens clucking, and pigs making whatever noises pigs make when they're judging your life choices. Cleanliness, as you might imagine, was not optimal in this arrangement. The floors were packed earth covered with straw that absorbed whatever fell on it, whether that was spilled food, animal waste, or mysterious liquids you preferred not to identify. The line between kitchen, bedroom, and barn was more of a vague suggestion than a clear boundary. But for Viking families, this trade-off made perfect sense. You could either stay warm and tolerate some agricultural ambiance, or you could freeze to death in a pristine environment. The choice was obvious. Children absolutely loved this arrangement. Free heating, built-in entertainment, and living pillows that occasionally provided fresh eggs. What more could a medieval kid want? Adults learned to appreciate the practical benefits while developing impressive abilities to sleep through barnyard sound effects and farmhouse aromatherapy. For Vikings, sharing sleeping space with animals wasn't a sign of poverty or lack of sophistication. It was smart resource management and proof that you were successfully maximizing your survival chances during the harshest months of the year. But perhaps the most extreme sleeping conditions Vikings faced occurred when they left the relative comfort and safety of their longhouses behind and took to the seas for raiding, trading, or exploration expeditions. Sleeping on a Viking longship was like trying to get comfortable in a floating wooden coffin that someone had forgotten to finish building. These vessels were engineering marvels designed for speed, intimidation, and the ability to appear suddenly on foreign shores like maritime nightmares. But comfort, that wasn't even on the blueprint. Viking longships were sleek, open-decked boats powered by sails and human muscle. They were built for functionality, not luxury accommodations. There were no cabins, no private quarters, no cozy little sleeping nooks with porthole windows. Just long stretches of wooden planking, rowing benches, and whatever equipment you could cram into the available space without sinking the entire vessel. When it came time to sleep aboard ship, Vikings had to get creative with extremely limited resources. Your bed was essentially whatever piece of deck space you could claim, hopefully somewhere that wasn't actively being used to store barrels of salted fish or navigate around icebergs. If you were lucky, someone might let you borrow a sail to use as a blanket. If you weren't lucky, you wrapped yourself in whatever clothing you had and tried not to roll overboard during the night. Sleep on a Viking ship was entirely dictated by weather conditions, ocean swells, and duty rotations. There was no schedule, no designated sleep hours, just pure exhaustion management. You rowed until your arms felt like they were going to fall off. Then you collapsed wherever you could find space and tried to catch some rest before your next shift. Sometimes this meant sleeping in your own sweat and sea spray. Other times it meant trying to nap while lying next to barrels of dried fish and a guy whose helmet had been leaking rainwater for the past 3 days. The crew rotated through different responsibilities throughout the day and night. Some people steered the ship, others rowed, and a few tried to grab moments of rest between their duties. But it wasn't restful sleep. It was more like extended periods of unconsciousness interrupted by waves, weather changes, and the constant creaking of wooden planks under stress. And then there were the smells: salt water, unwashed bodies, preserved food, and whatever livestock they might have brought along for the journey. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to sleep in a floating barn filled with exhausted warriors and questionable seafood, a Viking longship would give you the complete experience. Vikings weren't looking for comfort during these ocean voyages. They were focused on reaching their destination, with enough energy left to either trade successfully or raid effectively, depending on their intentions. Sleep on a ship wasn't about feeling refreshed. It was about surviving the journey and being able to function when you reached land. But Vikings had an even more complex relationship with sleep that went beyond mere physical rest. They believed that dreams weren't just random brain activity or subconscious processing. Dreams were direct communication from the gods, warnings from deceased relatives, and sometimes prophetic glimpses of future events. Viking sagas and epic poetry are filled with stories about significant dreams and their interpretations. These weren't casual bedtime stories. They were serious spiritual and political documents that treated dream interpretation as a crucial skill for survival and success. A dream about ships sailing west might mean death was approaching. Visions of cold winds blowing through your house could indicate family troubles or incoming disasters. Wolves running through the village in your sleep definitely meant something bad was about to happen, probably involving actual wolves or metaphorical wolves in human form. But dreams weren't entirely doom and gloom. Some visions were considered messages of divine favor from gods like Odin or Freya. These dreams might offer insights into upcoming battles, successful harvests, or hidden treasure locations. A good dream could elevate your social status and influence important decisions. A bad dream could make people avoid you, like you were carrying some kind of spiritual plague. Vikings even had specialized dream interpreters, people who were considered spiritually gifted and capable of decoding the symbolic language of sleep visions. These weren't ancient therapists interested in your childhood trauma or relationship issues. They wanted concrete symbols that could be translated into actionable information. Ravens, fire, ice, broken weapons, mysterious figures in cloaks. The weirder and more symbolic the dream, the more significant it was considered. Dreaming about the gods was treated as serious business with potentially life-changing implications. If Odin appeared in your dream offering advice, that was generally considered a positive sign, assuming you could understand what he was trying to tell you. If he appeared silent, wearing his traveling cloak and walking away from you, it was probably time to update your will and maybe reconsider that upcoming raid you'd been planning. There was also a belief in something called dream walking, the idea that your spirit could separate from your physical body during sleep and travel to other locations or realms. This meant that sleep wasn't just a passive state of rest. It was potentially an active form of spiritual exploration and even combat. You weren't just unconscious, you were possibly off fighting supernatural battles in other dimensions while your body recovered on a pile of straw. This spiritual dimension of sleep meant that Vikings took their rest very seriously. You weren't just recharging your physical energy, you were opening yourself up to divine communication and otherworldly experiences. Sleep was a gateway, a vulnerability, and sometimes a divine appointment all rolled into one. For Vikings, dreams weren't something that happened to you while you slept. They were an essential part of survival, requiring careful attention and interpretation. Some Vikings took their sleep preparation to an almost ritualistic level, especially when facing potentially dangerous situations. Warriors preparing for battle, raids, or hazardous journeys might approach their final night's rest as a sacred ceremony with life or death implications. The night before a major battle or raid, Viking warriors sometimes engaged in elaborate sleep rituals designed to ensure divine favor and spiritual protection. This wasn't about getting a good night's rest to feel refreshed. This was about demonstrating to the gods that you were prepared, worthy, and ready to die with honor if necessary. Warriors might sleep in full battle gear, not because it was comfortable, it definitely wasn't, but because they believed the gods appreciated readiness and preparation. Sleeping fully armed was like sending a message to Odin that you were taking the upcoming conflict seriously and weren't afraid to meet your fate. It was a form of spiritual insurance policy combined with practical battle preparation. Some believed that how you slept the night before a fight could actually influence where your soul ended up after death. If you were prepared, alert, and mentally focused on the upcoming battle, Odin might notice your dedication and mark you for Valhalla if you died honorably. If you were careless, comfortable, and unprepared, you might end up in hell, the cold and unpleasant afterlife reserved for people who died unheroically. This practice wasn't universal, partly because not everyone owned full battle gear. Armor was expensive and time-consuming to make. But even common Vikings might sleep in their traveling clothes or with weapons nearby before dangerous journeys. It was a symbolic gesture as much as a practical one, a way of declaring to both gods and companions that you were ready for whatever challenges awaited. The ritual also served practical purposes beyond spiritual protection. If you were attacked during the night, you didn't need to waste precious time getting dressed and armed. A properly prepared Viking warrior could go from sleeping to fighting in seconds, which could mean the difference between life and death in a surprise assault. This sleep preparation ritual reflects something fundamental about Viking culture. They didn't separate the physical and spiritual aspects of life into distinct categories. Everything was interconnected. Your sleep habits, your spiritual beliefs, your battle readiness, and your relationship with the gods all influenced each other in ways that required constant attention and respect. As winter descended on Scandinavia like a conquering army, Viking sleep patterns shifted dramatically. The short, dark days and seemingly endless nights created a natural rhythm that encouraged extended rest and reduced activity. This wasn't laziness or depression. This was intelligent adaptation to environmental conditions that could kill you if you didn't adjust accordingly. During the deepest winter months, when daylight lasted only a few hours and temperatures dropped to levels that could freeze facial hair solid, Vikings essentially entered a form of semi-hibernation. Not the biological hibernation that bears experience, but a cultural and practical response that prioritized energy conservation and survival over productivity and activity. With limited daylight, icy travel conditions, and reduced farming activities, there wasn't much incentive to maintain normal summer schedules. Why struggle out of your warm sleeping area at dawn when dawn didn't arrive until mid-morning? Why burn precious calories on unnecessary activities when food supplies needed to last until spring? Vikings learned to embrace longer sleep periods and reduced physical activity as sensible winter survival strategies. Extended winter sleep served multiple practical purposes. Less movement meant lower caloric needs, which was crucial when food storage and preservation were constant challenges. Bodies could recover from months of intensive labor, hunting, and warfare. Injuries had time to heal properly. Energy was conserved for essential activities like maintaining fires, caring for animals, and preparing for the next active season. Many Viking families would essentially shut down normal operations for days or weeks at a time during the worst weather. They'd crowd around the central hearth, share stories and memories, work on indoor crafts and repairs, and sleep extensively. It wasn't considered laziness. It was strategic resource management disguised as extended nap time. Some historical accounts even suggest that certain Viking communities experienced what might be called dream seasons, periods when the boundary between sleep and waking consciousness became blurred. Long nights, limited artificial lighting, and extended periods of rest created altered states of awareness that influenced their spiritual beliefs and cultural practices. Vikings viewed winter not just as a challenging season to endure, but as a mystical time when sleep, dreams, and spiritual reflection took on heightened significance. The darkness wasn't something to fight against with artificial lights and forced activity. It was something to embrace as part of the natural cycle that governed both human life and divine will. While most Viking sleep practices were focused on survival, warmth, and avoiding sudden death, there were occasions when Vikings deliberately chose not to sleep at all. These periods of intentional wakefulness weren't caused by insomnia, anxiety, or too much fermented honey. They were sacred rituals with deep spiritual and cultural significance. Certain Viking ceremonies and traditions required participants to remain awake throughout entire nights as demonstrations of respect, spiritual dedication, and community solidarity. These all-night vigils served multiple purposes and were considered essential parts of important life events and seasonal celebrations. During funerals, it was common for mourners to maintain vigil throughout the night, staying awake to honor the deceased and ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. These weren't quiet, somber affairs. They involved drinking, storytelling, reciting poetry, and sharing memories of the dead person's life and accomplishments. Think of it as a combination wake and Norse storytelling festival, except with more alcohol and occasional weapon displays. The funeral vigil served both practical and spiritual functions. Staying awake showed proper respect for the deceased and demonstrated the community's commitment to honoring their memory. It also provided an opportunity for people to process grief collectively and maintain social bonds during difficult times. And from a spiritual perspective, Vikings believed that the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was thinner during nighttime hours, especially immediately after someone had died. Warriors also practiced ritual wakefulness before major battles or raids. Spending the night before combat in meditation, prayer, and mental preparation was considered a form of spiritual conditioning. Some warriors claimed to receive prophetic visions or divine guidance during these sleepless nights, insights that could influence battle strategy or personal conduct during the fighting. There were also seers and spiritual practitioners who regularly stayed awake throughout entire nights to perform rituals, interpret omens, and communicate with supernatural forces. These individuals were expected to remain alert and spiritually receptive while others slept, serving as intermediaries between the human community and the divine realm. Ritual wakefulness wasn't just about staying awake. It was about achieving altered states of consciousness through sleep deprivation, spiritual focus, and community participation. Vikings understood that exhaustion, when combined with ritual activity and group support, could create profound psychological and spiritual experiences that strengthened individual resolve and community cohesion. These sleepless vigils weren't optional social events where you could politely decline and head home early. Participating in ritual wakefulness was considered a fundamental obligation, like paying taxes or showing up for military service. Falling asleep during a funeral vigil was roughly equivalent to texting during a eulogy, except with significantly higher social consequences and the possibility of being forcibly awakened by a concerned relative wielding a drinking horn. The spiritual aspect of these all-night ceremonies went beyond simple respect for tradition. Vikings believed that darkness amplified supernatural activity and divine communication. Staying awake during these crucial hours meant you could witness spiritual events, receive prophetic messages, or at minimum avoid missing something cosmically important while you were unconscious and drooling on your cloak. But ritual wakefulness also served as a form of endurance testing and community bonding. If you could stay alert and functional throughout an entire night of ceremonial activities, you demonstrated the kind of mental toughness that Viking culture valued. It proved you could handle pressure, maintain focus under difficult conditions, and prioritize group obligations over personal comfort. Some of these vigils involved specific activities designed to keep participants awake and spiritually engaged. Continuous storytelling, where different people took turns recounting sagas and legends. Competitive drinking, though this had obvious risks for maintaining consciousness. musical performances, poetry recitation, and ritual games that required active participation. The goal was to create an environment where sleep became practically impossible and spiritual awareness was heightened. For the most dedicated practitioners, particularly those with religious or mystical responsibilities, staying awake became a regular spiritual discipline rather than an occasional ritual requirement. These individuals developed techniques for managing extended periods without sleep while maintaining their effectiveness as spiritual guides and community leaders. After exploring all these strange sleep habits, one truth emerges about Viking rest patterns. They treated sleep as another battlefield where survival skills mattered more than comfort preferences. Modern people approach sleep like a wellness activity, something to optimize for health and happiness. Vikings approached sleep like everything else in their lives as a challenge that required strategy, preparation, and constant vigilance. Every aspect of Viking sleep was earned through effort and planning. They developed segmented sleep schedules because their environment and culture demanded it. They shared sleeping spaces with families and livestock because warmth was more valuable than privacy. They slept in their clothes and kept weapons nearby because comfort was negotiable, but readiness wasn't. They saw dreams as divine communications requiring careful interpretation. They practiced ritual wakefulness to honor the dead and prepare for battle. They adapted their sleep patterns to seasonal changes because fighting nature was less effective than working with it. Even their beds, when they had them, were designed around practical concerns like heat retention and space efficiency rather than luxury or individual preference. Viking sleep habits weren't about getting the perfect 8 hours of REM cycle optimization. They were about surviving harsh winters, dangerous enemies, and unpredictable circumstances while maintaining the physical and mental strength needed for demanding daily activities. Sleep was functional, social, and spiritual all at once. Their rest was earned through labor, shared with community members, and approached with the same practical mindset they applied to farming, fighting, and sailing across dangerous seas. They didn't romanticize sleep or treat it as an escape from reality. They integrated it into their survival strategy and cultural identity. Modern sleep science would probably diagnose Vikings with multiple sleep disorders, chronic sleep deprivation, and suboptimal rest conditions. But Vikings weren't trying to maximize sleep quality according to contemporary standards. They were trying to stay alive, maintain social bonds, and remain spiritually connected to their gods and ancestors while living in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Their approach to sleep reflected their broader philosophy about life. Toughness was admired over comfort. Community needs took precedence over individual preferences. Spiritual obligations were as important as physical necessities, and readiness for action was valued more than perfect rest conditions. Viking sleep wasn't about achieving ideal rest. It was about integrating rest into a lifestyle that prioritized survival, community, and spiritual awareness above personal comfort. They didn't invent sophisticated sleep optimization techniques, but they mastered the art of functional rest under extremely difficult circumstances. Their sleep habits also reveal something important about human adaptability. Vikings developed these practices not because they enjoyed discomfort, but because their environment and culture required these adaptations for survival. They created sleep strategies that worked within their constraints while serving their community needs and spiritual beliefs. Perhaps most remarkably, Vikings managed to maintain these challenging sleep patterns while accomplishing extraordinary feats of exploration, warfare, and cultural development. They crossed oceans in open boats, established settlements across multiple continents, and created a rich literary and artistic tradition, all while sleeping on dirt floors with livestock and maintaining constant vigilance against enemies. Their sleep habits weren't obstacles to achievement. They were integral parts of a cultural system that produced some of history's most successful explorers, warriors, and storytellers. Vikings proved that optimal sleep conditions aren't necessary for extraordinary accomplishments. As long as your rest strategies align with your environmental realities and cultural priorities. The segmented sleep patterns that seemed so strange to modern observers were actually sophisticated responses to the rhythms of pre-industrial life. The communal sleeping arrangements that might seem uncomfortable were effective solutions for heating, security, and social bonding challenges. The constant readiness for action that disrupted peaceful rest was a rational response to genuine threats. Vikings also understood something about sleep that modern culture sometimes forgets. Rest doesn't have to be perfect to be effective. Sleep doesn't have to be comfortable to be restorative. And individual sleep preferences matter less than community survival needs when you're living on the edge of environmental and social sustainability. Their approach to dreams and spiritual aspects of sleep reflected a worldview that integrated supernatural beliefs with practical daily activities. Sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a spiritual practice, a community activity, and a survival strategy, all combined into one essential life function. The ritual aspects of Viking sleep culture served important psychological and social functions that went beyond mere tradition. Funeral vigils helped communities process grief and maintain social cohesion. Pre-battle sleep rituals provided psychological preparation and spiritual comfort. Seasonal sleep adaptations helped people cope with extreme environmental changes. Even their most extreme practices, like sleeping in full armor or maintaining all-night vigils, served logical purposes within their cultural context. These weren't arbitrary hardships imposed by tradition. They were practical responses to real challenges that required community coordination and individual discipline. Viking sleep habits remind us that rest patterns are always shaped by environmental conditions, cultural values, and survival needs. What seems uncomfortable or impractical from a modern perspective made perfect sense within their historical context. Their sleep strategies were sophisticated solutions to complex challenges, not primitive practices that needed improvement. The legacy of Viking sleep culture extends beyond historical curiosity. Their emphasis on functional rest over optimal comfort offers insights for modern people dealing with sleep challenges. Their integration of spiritual and practical aspects of rest provides alternative perspectives on sleep's role in human life. Their community-centered approach to sleep arrangements suggests different ways of thinking about individual versus collective needs. Vikings mastered the art of sleeping strategically rather than sleeping perfectly. They understood that rest must serve life's demands rather than the other way around. And they proved that extraordinary achievements are possible even when sleep conditions are far from ideal, as long as rest strategies align with environmental realities and cultural priorities. Their sleep habits were just one part of a comprehensive survival strategy that enabled them to thrive in challenging conditions while maintaining rich cultural traditions and accomplishing remarkable feats of exploration and achievement. They didn't optimize sleep. They optimized survival. And sleep was one tool in that larger project, Modern people might not need to adopt Viking sleep practices, but we can learn from their approach to integrating rest with other life priorities. They understood that sleep serves life, not the other way around, and sometimes survival and achievement require sacrificing sleep comfort for more important goals. But the Vikings weren't done surprising us with their unconventional relationship with rest, because beyond all the practical considerations of warmth, safety, and survival, they had developed some truly bizarre beliefs about what happened to the human spirit during those vulnerable hours of unconsciousness. Vikings believed that during sleep, your soul could literally leave your body and wander around having adventures while you were unconscious. This wasn't considered a medical condition or supernatural anomaly. This was just Tuesday night in medieval Scandinavia. They called it dream walking, and it was taken as seriously as any other form of travel, except instead of packing supplies and getting directions, you just had to hope your spirit knew how to find its way back to your snoring body before morning. The concept went far beyond simple dreaming. Vikings thought that while your physical form was sprawled on a pile of straw, possibly drooling and definitely snoring, your spirit was potentially off fighting battles in other realms, visiting distant relatives, or gathering intelligence about enemy movements. This meant that sleep wasn't just downtime for physical recovery. It was an active form of spiritual reconnaissance that could provide valuable information about everything from weather patterns to upcoming conflicts. Some Vikings became so convinced of their dream-walking abilities that they'd plan their sleep schedules around spiritual missions. Need to check on a distant settlement? Take a nap and send your soul to investigate. Wondering what your enemies are planning? Sleep on it, literally, and see if your spirit can eavesdrop on their conversations. This approach to sleep intelligence gathering probably had mixed results, but it demonstrates just how seriously Vikings took the spiritual dimensions of rest. Dreamwalking also meant that falling asleep was potentially dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threats. If your spirit wandered too far from your body, got lost in supernatural realms, or encountered hostile spiritual forces, you might not wake up at all. This added another layer of risk to an already challenging sleep environment. Not only did you have to worry about raiders, wild animals, and freezing temperatures, you also had to concern yourself with spiritual navigation and otherworldly combat. The belief in dreamwalking influenced how Vikings prepared for sleep and interpreted their rest experiences. Unusual dreams weren't just random brain activity. They were potentially reports from spiritual expeditions that your soul had undertaken while your body recovered. Nightmares might indicate that your spirit had encountered dangerous supernatural forces. Peaceful dreams suggested successful spiritual journeys. And if you woke up feeling exhausted despite having slept for hours, well, maybe your soul had been working the night shift in another dimension. This spiritual understanding of sleep created additional responsibilities for rest that went far beyond physical recovery. You weren't just recharging your body's energy reserves. You were potentially gathering intelligence, fighting spiritual battles, and maintaining relationships with supernatural forces that could influence your waking life in profound ways. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Viking sleep culture was how they approached death and rest as fundamentally connected experiences. For Vikings, sleep was practice for dying, and dying was just a longer form of sleep with different destination options. The connection between sleep and death wasn't morbid or depressing from a Viking perspective. It was practical preparation for an inevitable transition that required spiritual readiness and cultural understanding. They believed that how you lived, how you slept, and how you died were all interconnected aspects of the same cosmic journey that determined your ultimate destination in the afterlife. This is why Vikings took their pre-battle sleep rituals so seriously. The night before potentially fatal combat wasn't just about physical rest, it was about spiritual preparation for a possible transition from temporary sleep to permanent death. Warriors who slept in their armor weren't just being practical about quick response times. They were demonstrating to the gods that they were ready for whatever form of rest awaited them, whether it was a few hours of unconsciousness or an eternity in Valhalla. The quality of your sleep could actually influence your post-death accommodations, according to Viking beliefs. Dying while spiritually prepared and mentally alert might earn you a spot in Odin's Great Hall, where fallen warriors spent eternity feasting and fighting. Dying while unprepared, spiritually lazy, or mentally unfocused might land you in hell, the cold and dreary afterlife reserved for people who failed to live and die with proper Viking enthusiasm. This connection between sleep quality and afterlife destinations meant that Vikings couldn't afford to be casual about their rest habits. Every night was potentially your last night, and how you spent those final hours of consciousness could determine where you spent eternity. No pressure or anything, but you better make sure your spiritual paperwork was in order before you closed your eyes. The belief system also influenced how Vikings viewed different types of sleep disturbances and rest-related problems. Insomnia might indicate spiritual unrest or divine displeasure. Nightmares could be warnings about upcoming dangers or messages from deceased relatives. Sleepwalking might suggest that your soul was practicing for its eventual permanent departure from your body. Even their approach to helping people with sleep problems reflected these spiritual concerns. Treatment for rest-related issues involved prayers, rituals, and spiritual consultations rather than medical interventions or environmental modifications. If you couldn't sleep properly, the solution wasn't changing your mattress or adjusting your room temperature. The solution was figuring out what spiritual issue was preventing your soul from achieving proper rest. Vikings also believed that certain types of death were more favorable than others when it came to afterlife arrangements, and these preferences influenced their sleep preparation rituals. Dying in battle while fully conscious and fighting vigorously was ideal. Dying peacefully in your sleep while spiritually prepared was acceptable. Dying unexpectedly while unprepared was problematic, and dying while asleep and spiritually careless was potentially catastrophic for your eternal prospects. This created interesting tensions around sleep depth and spiritual alertness. You needed rest for physical recovery and mental clarity, but you also needed to maintain enough spiritual awareness to handle unexpected transitions from sleep to death. The ideal Viking sleep state involved being physically relaxed but spiritually vigilant, ready to wake up refreshed or transition to the afterlife with equal preparedness. The seasonal aspects of Viking sleep culture took on additional significance when viewed through this spiritual lens. Winter wasn't just a time for extended physical rest. It was a season for spiritual reflection and preparation for the possibility that you might not survive until spring. Extended winter sleep periods provided opportunities for intensive dream work, spiritual communication, and mental preparation for potential death. Summer sleep patterns, with their emphasis on vigilance and readiness, reflected the increased likelihood of warfare, raiding, and other potentially fatal activities during the active season. You slept lightly not just because enemies might attack, but because death might arrive suddenly, and you needed to be spiritually prepared for immediate transition to the afterlife. The communal aspects of Viking sleep arrangements also served spiritual functions beyond practical warmth and security considerations. Sleeping surrounded by family members and community provided spiritual witnesses who could testify to your character and conduct if you died during the night. They could also perform appropriate rituals and ceremonies to ensure your proper transition to the afterlife. The presence of weapons during sleep wasn't just about physical defense. It was about spiritual readiness to meet the gods while properly equipped as a warrior. Arriving in Valhalla unarmed would be like showing up to a job interview without a resume. Technically possible, but not likely to make a good impression on your potential eternal employers. Even the practice of sleeping in regular clothes rather than specialized sleepwear reflected spiritual preparedness concerns. You wanted to be ready to transition from sleep to action or from life to afterlife without the embarrassment of being caught spiritually underdressed for either scenario. The integration of livestock into sleeping arrangements provided spiritual benefits beyond practical heating considerations. Animals were believed to have their own spiritual awareness that could provide additional protection and early warning about supernatural threats. A cow's spiritual vigilance combined with human spiritual preparedness created layered protection against both physical and metaphysical dangers. The Viking approach to sleep represented a comprehensive integration of physical, social, and spiritual concerns that modern sleep science doesn't typically address. They understood rest as a complex activity that served multiple functions simultaneously and required constant attention to environmental, cultural, and cosmic factors. Their sleep habits weren't just about surviving harsh physical conditions. They were about maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces, preparing for spiritual transitions, and integrating rest into a worldview that saw all aspects of life as interconnected and spiritually significant. The apparent discomfort and inconvenience of Viking sleep practices make more sense when viewed as spiritual disciplines rather than mere survival strategies. The hardships weren't arbitrary traditions or unavoidable environmental constraints. They were intentional practices designed to maintain spiritual alertness and demonstrate worthiness to the gods. Vikings mastered the art of sleeping spiritually as well as physically. They developed rest practices that served their souls as well as their bodies, and they created sleep cultures that prepared them for both temporary unconsciousness and permanent transition to whatever awaited them beyond this life. Modern people might not share Viking beliefs about dreamwalking, spiritual combat, or afterlife destinations, but their approach to integrating spiritual awareness with practical rest needs offers interesting perspectives on sleep's role in human experience. They understood that how you sleep reflects who you are and what you value, and they proved that rest practices can serve purposes far beyond simple physical recovery. The legacy of Viking sleep culture reminds us that sleep is never just about sleep. It's about survival, community, spirituality, and preparation for whatever challenges and transitions life might bring. Vikings didn't just rest their bodies, they rested strategically, socially, and spiritually, creating sleep practices that served their comprehensive understanding of what it meant to live courageously in an uncertain world. Their sleep habits were expressions of their values, adaptations to their environment, and preparations for their destiny. They slept like Vikings because they lived like Vikings, understanding that every aspect of life, including rest, required the same courage, community commitment, and spiritual awareness that they brought to exploration, warfare, and cultural achievement. So tonight, when you slide into your temperature-controlled bedroom with your memory foam mattress, blackout curtains, and white noise machine, take a moment to appreciate the luxury of sleeping for comfort rather than survival. The Vikings managed to explore continents, create lasting cultural legacies, and build legendary reputations while sleeping on dirt floors with farm animals and weapons at their sides. They didn't need perfect sleep conditions to achieve extraordinary things. They just needed sleep practices that aligned with their values, served their communities, and prepared them for whatever adventures awaited in both dreams and waking life. And maybe, just maybe, that's something we can all learn from as we drift off into our own, much more comfortable, but perhaps less spiritually adventurous slumber.